So we might as well get started. So what I'd like to talk about is the next topic, which is APIs. And I'll just put the PowerPoint presentation on so we have the screen. So talk a little bit about web services and also JSON, JavaScript, object notation language, and just a little bit about some background to that, and then how we can specifically how we can use JSON and also web services inside of Android. There's the actual APIs and things are a little bit different. So we'll just look at all of the, I suppose, the life cycle for that. So how you can set it all up, how you bring in the library. The Google Volley library is a little bit tricky to set up sometimes, a little bit tricky to use. But I'll show you all of the different steps to set it up and set up a request and get some responses back. And we'll look at building those up. We'll also have a look at using another little library called Picasso, which you can use to download images and things similar to that from the internet, and to then take that image information and then load it into something like an image view. So web services, hopefully you have all heard of web services before, but the basic idea is that there's some kind of service or database that you'd like to expose, and instead of having to build your own protocol for distributing the information, you can publish that information over HTTP or HTTPS. And so there's multiple different architectures here. There's things like SOAP, which is I think that was kind of peaked around in the mid 2000s, around 2005 is my feeling. It's probably a bit more old-fashioned now, but the idea, well, that was I suppose the first iteration of web services, and the idea there was that you could publish and consume XML documents over HTTP. And so you could you could make requests to a backend server and using HTTP GET requests and then get responses back in XML. And so the same kind of thing applies to more modern architectures where you've got your RESTful interfaces. And typically when you have a REST interface, you'll be retrieving responses. So you'll have your response message encoded in JSON. And right now, this is a very popular way of connecting mobile applications to backend services. So that's why we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at this, and this is also going to be one of the focuses of our second assignment. So with HTTP, you've got GET requests. Can anybody tell me any of the other types of requests that you can have? You can either just use your microphone or use the chat. It's always a little bit confusing as where the chat has gone. Okay, nobody's mentioning anything on the chat. Have you heard of HTTP GET requests before?
file transfer protocols?
Yeah, there's file transfer protocols, FTP, which you may have heard of before. But for actual web services, there's a whole lot of other things that you can do. So let me give you an example. So one way of interacting with these web services is, through the browser. So I'm going to have a look at a couple of demo web services. So one way of doing that is through the browser. So I've got some example URLs here. Just open those URLs up in the browser. And you can get a response back like this. So the idea is that you've got some kind of API that you're interested in, and by manipulating the GET request query string, then you can programmatically change the type of information that is retrieved. Right. So this dog API is a nice simple one. It's all about it connects a database of dog images and dog information. So by changing the URL, you can get different responses back. So one way of interacting with that is, of course, using the browser. Go back to the top level project, and then it brings the home screen. As you can see, it's all about open source dog images. And here's another example. Back some information about English Mastiff. So that's just to give you an idea. Of course, all different APIs that you can use. This is a list of all of the different dog breeds. And this is the JSON response. So you can put that, into the web browser as well. Like this, and you get the results back. I can hear somebody's got their microphone on. Did anybody have a question? All right, so you can use the web browser, but normally you wouldn't want to do that. So I'm experiencing quite a bit of feedback. I'm going to see if I can mute everybody else. If you're not on mute, could you please mute yourself? So we've got the list of all the different dog breeds here. So by manipulating the list, the URL, we're able to change by breed. So, for example, by this type of URL, you can see we retrieve all of the images that relate to dogs. So what we can do is, if we know a dog breed, we can set that string into this into the path here that we have for our URL. So I'm not very good with dog breeds, so I'm just going to grab one from here and go with a call here. And so we've got call here. You can see that the information is changed. So by simply manipulating the URL, we're able to get different results. So that's one way of interacting with an API, to do it just using the web browser. Normally, though, as a developer, this is probably only the first step, and normally there's very, very few times I interact with a web service with a web browser. I normally use my go-to tool, and that is Postman. Okay, so that is a freely available tool that lets you basically construct different web service requests. And you can change this as well. We get those same data using our environment. So this is much more program friendly. It's and it also does things like printing the message. And it generally makes it a lot easier to interact with the web service as a software developer. And there's a huge range of different things that we can do here. So right now I've been talking about GET requests, but there's a whole range of other HTTP web service verbs that are also or operations that are also available. So you've got things like post, port, delete, all sorts of other things. Lock, all that kind of stuff. With person, there's also other things that you can interact with.
Excuse me? Sorry, John?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, your voice sounds blur. I don't know if like maybe there's some problem with the mic.
Oh, really? Okay. Is that better? I'm just speaking a little bit more closely to the microphone.
Oh, yeah, maybe.
Maybe. Yeah, I'll try and be a bit clearer and maybe turn my sound up. Does it help if I turn my sound up?
Yeah, better. Thank you.
Better? That's better? Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you for letting me know. Yeah, so we can manipulate the URL and also do other things like set header values. So if you have a more complex web service that you want to interact with, you often have to set headers, HTTP header values. You can also do other things like set form data. So if you are a web developer, you'll know all about HTML forms, and so you can add parameters here for various different types of forms, and you can also post that to a web service. So this is a very, very common way in modern web application development to interact with external services and also external databases. Or cloud-based databases as well, all of those different things. So it's, I suppose the whole industry is moving in this direction. And there's this type of technology, it has a couple of different names as well. So we call it things like web services. We call it things like web RPC. RPC stands for remote procedure call. And we also call it other things like microservices. I don't know if anybody's heard of microservices, but that's another industry buzzword. But they all basically mean the same thing. It's where you have a web request like this, you have a web server, and by manipulating the URL, perhaps manipulating the other properties of your request, you are able to interact and programmatically change the information retrieved. That's just a little rundown of that. So I highly recommend that you download Postman. I'll place links and things, if I haven't already, onto Moodle. And that'll help you with your second assignment. Okay, how did we get up to? Yeah, so we're just looking at some examples. Any questions so far, guys? Hopefully that was, this stuff should, it sounds complicated, but it should, for the most part, be relatively easy. We'll mostly be making GET requests. And we'll only really be working on developing our own client applications as well. So we don't have any of the added complexity of setting up our own database or setting up our own web service either. Okay, and so some other examples, there's the GeoNet example. Which I haven't looked at yet, so I'll have a look at that. There's all sorts of APIs, guys. The dog one has a low barrier to entry. It's very easy to work with. There are other APIs as well. There's some APIs available from the New Zealand government. One of the more interesting ones is the GeoNet API. And so all around New Zealand, there's little earthquakes going on all the time. And so if you're interested in integrating that data with your application or your work in some way, you can query their API. So, and again, it's all accomplished by manipulating your GeoNet URL. So, for example, if we go with an MMI of 3, then we are going to get this kind of data back. So you can see that this is much more complex. The data that we get here is much more complex, much more complicated than the data API. So we can get things like time, public ID, there's a textual description of the locality, other information as well, such as the coordinates, that's the latitude and longitude, and all sorts of other information as well. So we can develop our own little application. We'll have a look at that in a minute to make a HTTP connection through GeoNet and also download that information and then slice and dice the information. So useful things for it. There's a random image of the day API from NASA. So if you put in this URL here, something like NASA request, and then you'll get a random picture
That I
Yep,
think
go ahead.
your sound is going to a terrifying sound.
Say again.
I thought it was the ghost.
There's quite a lot of echo. Maybe I'm not sure what's wrong. I haven't actually changed anything since last week. Should we try turning it on and off again? I might just stop the presentation.
No, yeah, it's fine.
It's
It was
fine.
just that last part. I think.
It's a little
The
bit of
last sentence.
sometimes if people aren't on mute, there could be an echo. But I can't hear myself, so I don't know. So with the next one, it looks like this.
It's just on and off. Sometimes good, sometimes not.
Okay. Strange. Maybe everybody in my neighborhood is using the internet. I'm not sure. Probably they are. Maybe. I'm not sure. So you can get URLs and then you can get an image. then download the image. So you can do all of that from Postman. So if I'm not clear in any of these situations, just let me know. Okay. So I think that's enough with the examples. Sometimes API. The Game of Thrones API is another interesting one to try out. You guys can have a bit of a play around with it. But the whole idea is about is manipulating those query strings, those path parameters, and changing those to get different responses. And here's a little bit of information about JSON. So hopefully everybody is a little bit familiar with JSON from your other classes. So you can do things like define objects and arrays, but mostly you can define arrays. And just give me a minute, guys. My children are having a fight. I'm just going to go on mute and see what the problem is. Okay, so I'm back. Sorry about that. Okay, so I was talking a little bit about JSON. Square brackets, they define arrays. Curly brackets, they define objects. And it's really all about defining these key value pairs. So the key is defined first in quotation marks. Then you've got a little separator with a colon. And then the next piece of data that is defined in quotation marks as well. And all of the different key value properties, they're all separated by commas. If you've got some integer values that may not necessarily have quotation marks. But generally, as a machine format, JSON is a lot more programmer readable than say something like XML. So you can look at it and see for the most part what's actually happening. So we can see here that somebody's defined an array of different colors and the different properties of those colors. So this JSON stuff, it might be something that's new, but it should be something that you can pick up very readily. Okay. And so what I want to look at next is the GeoNet application. And we'll take a look at how this works. But basically, I've got a little button which does a web service request, and then that is going to pull in all of the different information, the textual description out of the JSON payload inside of our Java application. So to actually set up a to actually set this up is a little bit tricky, so we'll go through that step by step. And hopefully my voice is better now.
A lot better.
A lot better? Okay, that's good. I'm not sure what the difference, what happened. So we can slice and dice the data. The data that in question that we're actually slicing and dicing is the information from GeoNet itself. So we're making this similar type of request inside of our Android application, right? And so for the actual 5 kilometers north of Ohakuni, that, or 10 kilometers southeast of Lower Hutt, that information is coming out of this JSON payload. It's basically the locality field that is getting dug out of the JSON payload. So with Volley, the little Android web services library, there's also some supporting JSON library as well that allows us to slice and dice all of that data. So we'll jump into that as well. But the step-by-step instructions for setting this up looks like this. So the first thing that you need to do is to add the Gradle, sorry, not the Gradle, but the Volley library to Gradle. And so you have to copy this little string into your build.gradle file in your module. And the way that we do that is like this. So you should be able to see my desktop right now and see my little build.gradle file. And here we go. So this needs to contain the implementation from .android.volley and then Volley version 1.1. So you'll see here that there's a change. In the previous screenshot, it was compiled, now it's implementation. And the problem is, I don't know if I've explained yet what Gradle is, but it's a package management system, right? So over here, this is what we call an external library or an external dependency that is going to get downloaded from the internet. There's a repository called Maven Central, which has a lot of these open source libraries, and there's also a Google repository as well. I believe this is probably, since it's a Google product, a Google library, it's probably downloaded from the Google repository. So this is build.gradle file here. This is our project's dependencies. And this build.gradle over here, this is actually the entire project's dependency. So you can see here that we've got a Google repository set up, and we've also got the JCenter repository set up. And if we wanted to, we could also add other open source repositories to that as well, like the Maven Central one. So if we want to get this working, we have to this project as a first step. And to make it a lot easier, I think I'll just copy and paste this into the Discord chat. I can also copy and paste it into the chat for Zoom as well. That's the first step. The second step is to set up permissions. So with this web services process, we also need to request some extra permissions available in Android. And the way to do that is to define some extra permissions in our Android manifest file. So there's a couple of steps to set this up. So again, this is something that I can just copy and paste into because you guys are going to be doing this really soon. So you've got those strings available in the description as well. It just makes it a little bit easier than just trying to copy it out. Less error prone than just trying to transcribe it from the slide where I think it's an image. The permissions. Actually, accessing the internet is a privileged permission. It doesn't happen by default, and yeah, so there's privileged permissions. And the way to ask for those privileged permissions is to just not copy, but is to define the permissions that you want your application to use up here in your Android manifest file. Okay, what's next? So look at the permissions. And so the next thing is to look at a request queue. It's actually easier to just have a look at how the code hangs together. And so I will get that, I think. So we've got here. Activity. Everything so far should hopefully be familiar to you. The main thing that we want to do if we are going to use Poly is to create a request queue. And so this is just a, I suppose, an abstract way of making web requests. So just a little bit of an abstraction, having a queue. So I think this is one of the things that perhaps people don't quite, doesn't quite mesh with them the first time they look at this. So if we want to make a HTTP request, we have to create a queue. That's the basic, like the preliminary thing. So create a request queue. And then set it up button handling. So button binding. We also set up a one-click listener. And then from there, you can see here that we've just got the URL, it's HTTPS URL, and we want all of the JSON records with an MMI of 1, right? And then we've got some code down here to do all of the JSON processing. I'll come back to that in a minute. So just minimize that for a moment. So there's an error handler as well. Just minimize that. So the complex part of this is that we have to create this JSON object request. But the easy part, but the part that people forget is that you create your JSON object request, right? But then you have to add it to the queue. You have to add it to the queue. So you create your request up here, until we process our JSON. But to actually make something happen, you have to add it to the queue. So when that happens, your Android application is going to make a HTTP get request, and then bring the information back. Find the type of method that we're interested in. So over here, with all of these examples, we're really only interested in a GET request. But if you wanted to use any of those other HTTP verbs, different methods that you can use, things like delete, post, put, etc., then you can select those. And then over here we can define the URL with a URL string, and so you can select any of those different options that are available in your website based on those parameters. And then over here, we've got a JSON request object. This is null. Can anybody tell me why is the JSON request object null? Why is that null, guys? Go with the 12 or the 22nd. Everybody wanted to put their hand up. But it's null because we're not posting any information to that particular website. So with a lot of these web services, you can take a JSON object and you can send that JSON object to the remote server. And because we're not doing that in this particular instance, our JSON request object is null, so it's passing a null there. So this is where we are setting up the request. So it's really just like loading that page, that URL, in a web browser. But instead of doing it inside the web browser or inside of Postman, we're now doing it programmatically inside of our Android application. And then, so the next part to that JSON object request is the response listener, right? And this is where all of the complex behavior that our application has, that's where all of that is actually performed. Just expand that out. So with the response listener, it has a little callback method called response. Does everybody know what a callback method is? Have you heard of callbacks before? You may not have heard of callbacks before. If you haven't, that's okay. But the quick definition of a callback is it's a method that gets called in response to some kind of event. So you would have seen callbacks before with things like the on-click event handler. So over here we've got the on-click listener event handler. That method is a so-called callback method. So that's just a little bit more programmer terminology for you. So on-click, you know, that callback method that gets triggered when somebody clicks the button, and it's the same deal here with our on-response method here. So that on-response method is going to get called when the web service request has connected and retrieved the response from the remote server. Right? So being a user interaction event, like with an on-click listener. This is a different type of listener in that it's listening for some network traffic. It's listening for have we downloaded that response object yet. So we've got our JSON object response. There. We actually have a JSON object. It's just a nice little wrapper around our data. And then using all of the different helper methods on that little wrapper object, we can then slice our data. So over here, we're interested in the JSON features. And so that corresponds to the data that we're seeing over here. So when you're doing web service development, you'll find yourself moving between Postman, I think, and your Android IDE. So you can see here that we've got properties like the type property, and we've also got other properties like this features array. So we know it's an array because we've got square brackets. So over here in our code, right, because we know it's a array, we can determine that we want to use the get array method, and then retrieve the entire array. So this type of structure that we see here, we need to hand code that. We need to hand code that for whatever web service it is that we're using. If we go back to something else, like the dog breeds, for example, we're going to have a different response value. Much simpler message structure. Much simpler. So we've got our array, and then we use a little for loop here to iterate over each of those JSON objects, still using those built-in Android JSON object wrappers, so we can interact with those properties and objects programmatically. Okay, so we can see here that I'm now getting a JSON object. I've called that a Quake object. And so that what that Quake object actually corresponds to is this. Let's have a quick look. So each of those corresponds to this particular object. Yeah, one of those. So perhaps Quake isn't exactly correct. In the actual array here, they're referring to them as features. So perhaps feature would be a better name. But these are all of the different properties available on feature. And I believe what I'm doing next is I'm digging into the properties element, and then I'm digging into the locality element. And so let's jump back into the code and have a look at that. And you can see here that by, I guess, drilling down step by step into those different properties, I'm then able to get at the property, the string property that I'm actually interested in. And so I'm able to get all of those different pieces of locality information, slice and dice the data, and then put that into my little string builder locality string builder object. So I'll bring that out to the console. We've got some code here to handle any errors. So you never know with JSON whether it's going to be well formed or not. Sometimes it's not well formed. So if you're the client, you really never know, I suppose, whether the server is actually working correctly. People update these services all the time, and so they might introduce a breaking change which breaks your client. And so it's really important when you're doing these types of operations to slice and dice, massage your data into the format that you want, that you also catch any errors and also handle those errors properly. I guess the minimum type of error handling that you want is to at least look at the stack trace. But I've seen a lot of new programmers, right? They have this problem where they're not catching an exception, but and what they do is they just leave the actual catch code blank. That's the wrong thing to do. Any ideas why that might be the wrong thing to do? With the 20-second rule again. The main reason why that's the wrong thing to do is that if there's any exceptions, we're just totally ignoring them. So this makes our program hard to debug and also makes our program hard to maintain because we just don't know what's actually going on. If there's any errors here, the code is going to jump into the error handler over here, the exception handler, and then because we don't have any code in here, it's just going to be totally ignored. And then we'll probably find that later on, our code is going to fail, but then fail for a reason that we're not sure why. So whenever you code a try-catch block like this, make sure you actually put some code in there. At minimum, you really need to put in a print stack trace. Otherwise, you'll be making your life hard. You'll come to debug it a week later, perhaps, or a month later, or 6 months later, and then things will be happening, and you won't have that. You won't have any support from the try-catch block working properly to work out what's going wrong. So we built up our localities builder, right? And then so we just put that over here by setting the text on that particular text view. Just over there. And the second part of that request, right, is the error listener. So there could be certain situations where the website is in maintenance mode. We've got some network connectivity problems, and in any of those kind of situations, what's going to happen is that our volley error handler is going to be invoked over here. So again, you really need to have something in here and actually properly handle these properly handle the on-error response callback. And so that's how you structure a web service request, and then that's also how you can slice and dice the return data to extract the different properties and things that you're interested in displaying in your application. And that's actually it. So not too hard, not too tricky. What's next? Let's have a look at the lecture notes. We talked about creating a request queue. This is just a reiteration of what I was just talking about in a little bit more detail. This is just a another example of creating a JSON request queue and a JSON request object. This is some information about processing those things, doing all of the slicing and dicing and massaging the data. Just look at that. And these are the things that I'd like to work on. But before we get into that, I'd also like to talk a little bit about Picasso. That's another little program that I find quite useful and interesting. So let's jump into that little project. Right. So over here, we've got so this is an incredibly easy piece of software to use. You just have to include it in your project. And that's it. It actually just works. So the main thing that it does is load images into your program. So we have a very simple program. It has an image view widget, and it also has a button widget. And over here, what we're doing is we're instantiating our Picasso object, and then from there, what we do is we load the URL of the image that we're interested in. So this is just an image from Unitech. This is just a random image, and it's got this nice little Fluent API to just say, download that image and then put that image into my image view. And it actually just works. It's amazing. This, we've basically only got 4 lines of code to do this. If you had to do this manually, it'd be a huge amount of code that you'd have to write. So we've got our little Picasso project here, and so we click the button. It's going to load the image using all of the Picasso code over here. So the library does all of the heavy lifting for you. And then if you want to load images into your application from the web, this is how you do it. So we've got 3-4 lines of code here to do that. We can probably even, I know we can actually do this with a one-liner actually. So if we do this, we can actually do this with a one-liner. Just get rid of this. Extract that into a little variable. So, using Picasso is basically just a one-liner like that. So you get a huge amount of functionality for this one-liner code. It's very good. And if you want to use that, you need to Picasso library over here. And again, that's just another external dependency. This one is not developed by Google, but it's very, very popular. Problems that I've noticed with it are that if there's any kind of redirect when you're loading an image, I know there's some image services out there for things like GIFs and just images, kind of joke images and that type of stuff. They often do redirects with a shortened URL. There's some other tricks and things that you'll have to do to get Picasso to follow those redirects. But apart from that, it just works and works quite well. Any questions about that, guys? If not, are there any questions about the assignment?
Can we use a date picker for, time picker for the timing?
Try and use a built-in widget if you can.
All right.
It's the first assignment, so I don't expect people to use any whiz-bang external widgets. See if you can just implement. You should be able to implement it just using the internal tools.
So use the list bots. Combo bots.
Yeah, I text you. Text that would be. Just use like an A/B text for the date. Probably be okay. You could use a combination of these widgets.
Yeah.
I would recommend. There's probably some kind of combination of these widgets all kind of rolled into one library, but I would just see if you can use a time and date widget. But try and keep it as simple as possible.
Gotcha.
Okay, so what I would like people to do today is to actually try and implement certain things. So have a go at implementing this stuff in Picasso. See if you can do that. I tried to make everything as easy as possible for you, but it is important to try and replicate what I've done. And it's even more important to replicate this with other APIs. So I introduced the Docs API before. Maybe you could write a small Android application to use a JSON object request and volley to download a URL for an image, and then see if you can load that image using Picasso. I would say that would probably be 20, 30 lines of code max, but it should cover off all of the important things that you need to do for assignment 2. I know I haven't talked about assignment 2 as yet, but that's something that we can talk about next week. And the other thing with assignment 1, I tried to give us enough buffer, but the other important thing with that is that the due date is the 10th of September, so hopefully everybody is still comfortable with that. Let me just remind you that the due date is rapidly approaching. Have a break for 5 minutes. You know what you need to do for today. Try and implement I would try and use that API and download information about a particular breed, and then use Picasso to load that image. I'm just about to copy and paste the Picasso tutorial into the chat window. So I'll be away for 5-10 minutes and come back and see if anybody has any other questions. Try and rack your brain. Now that we've got some time, just try and rack your brains about the first assignment. Right now is a perfect time to ask about any problems that you have with that first assignment. I'll be back in 10 minutes, guys.